Very much, and it's a pleasure for me to be here today. Thank you all for coming to hear what I have to say. I know that we can't stay in this room forever, so I'm going to move right along without telling you my usual 3 or 4 jokes that I use to start a speech. But in economics, if we don't really know something, we just assume it's the case. So I'd like you to assume I'm very funny. Much of what I'm going to talk to you about is not funny at all. I'm sorry to report. Indeed, it's somewhere between shocking and tragic, but it's very important, and I think it's one of the most important subjects I've ever studied. I devoted a number of years to this subject as my main research interest, and even though most of my work in the area occurred in the 1990s, what I have to say, I believe, is still current today. So let me tell you what it is that I've found, and I hope I'll be finished in time for us to have some time for questions at the end. If you were suffering from a serious disease, would you prefer that A, you and your doctor decide how to treat your ailment, selecting from all existing medical goods the ones that offer the best combination of benefits and risks, or B, that you and your doctor select from all medical goods except those, possibly the most promising ones, that a low-level government employee in Rockville, Maryland, has decided to withhold from you? The answer is obvious. Rational people would never consider themselves better off because the range of choice had been arbitrarily limited. Yet, such restriction of consumer choice affecting both patients and their physicians fetters consumers at all times in the United States. The Food and Drug Administration alone decides whether a newly devised medical good, either a drug or a device, may be sold. Many potentially beneficial goods remain on the shelf for a decade or more, while their manufacturers traverse the rigid and elaborate testing procedures required by the FDA before it will approve marketing. While innovative medical goods run the bureaucratic gamut, people who could have benefited from their use suffer and sometimes die unnecessarily. Defenders of the government's actions insist that without the FDA's regulations, greater harm would occur. Consumers would suffer from the toxicity or adverse side effects of unsafe products, or they would squander their money on useless remedies. Consumers can avoid these injuries if they are permitted to use only medical goods that have met high standards of safety and efficacy by passing successfully through the FDA's required testing. The FDA's tests are much too complicated for me to describe in this lecture, or even in a whole course of lectures for that matter. I encourage you to go to the FDA website, however, and look at some of the material displayed there by the agency itself. If you want to see more critical information, I encourage you to go to a website called fdareview.org, which is a repository of a great deal of analytical and scholarly independent information about studies that have been done on the FDA and its activities. fdareview.org, and you'll find all sorts of information there that is not consistent with the official line that you will find at the FDA's own website. But nonetheless, I encourage you to visit that website because you can learn a lot from it alone about all the things the FDA attempts to do and presumes to do and claims to know how to do, all for the benefit of the public. Now, just in very brief summary, the FDA is in charge of regulating a number of different products, including processed foods, drugs, pharmaceuticals, that is, medical devices, radiological products, biologics, so-called, involving living tissue, pet food, cosmetics. All of these things add up to approximately 25% of all consumer spending in the United States. So this agency's jurisdiction is vast, and its ability to withhold products from the market or to remove products from the market once they've gone there is virtually peremptory. It's unchallenged. It acts as it decides to act. And of course, it can be taken to court, but if you take it to court, you're almost certainly going to lose. And if you're a firm that deals with the FDA and you challenge its actions, you will find that the FDA is very vindictive and has many ways to get you, including ways that will bankrupt your firm and drive it out of existence. And there are many cases in which this has happened. So it's not to be taken lightly at all. In testimony before a congressional committee, an FDA official said the following: "The allegation has been made that the cost to our society to prevent a thalidomide-type tragedy far exceeds the benefits of a regulatory system developed to prevent such a tragedy. We disagree. We believe that benefits which accrue to society because of our regulatory system are worth the cost and far outweigh the risks." End quote. This statement, which expresses the agency's standard line, is remarkable in at least 5 ways. First, it uses the most notorious medical tragedy of modern times to illustrate what presumably the FDA's regulatory system routinely prevents. The presumption is indefensible. Except in a freakishly unlikely case, one may not reasonably assume that an unrestricted manufacturer would sell a medical good giving rise to a thalidomide-type tragedy. Besides their ethics, manufacturers have good financial reasons, including product liability judgments and loss of consumer confidence, to be careful about what they place on the market. Second, the statement I quoted stands alone, without any attempt to demonstrate that the lives saved and the suffering prevented exceed the lives lost and the suffering endured as a result of the FDA's regulation. It's merely a naked declaration, which the audience presumably should accept because it emanates from the self-proclaimed experts. Third, the statement speaks of the benefits and costs of the regulation as if they were experienced by society at large, rather than by specific individuals who differ enormously in their personal valuation of the costs and benefits and in their willingness to bear risk. It rests upon the unspoken assumption that a single rule should apply in all cases, mocking the actual heterogeneity of people's preferences and medical conditions. Fourth, the statement confidently declares we disagree and we believe, while describing the balance of benefits and costs experienced by others. But only specific individuals can possibly know whether the benefits to them outweigh the costs to them. Neither the benefits nor the costs can be objectively assessed by third parties, nor may the benefits and costs experienced by many individuals be aggregated into total or social valuations and thereby made comparable. There is no common unit of account in which the aggregation may be made. Who knows how to measure the depth of one person's fear, the breadth of another's relief? Fifth, the statement presumes an answer, the wrong answer, to the question posed by AIDS activist and FDA critic Martin Delaney. Quote, who should decide which risks are acceptable? The bureaucracy in Washington or the patient whose life is on the line? The FDA has arrived at its position of great power at present through a very interesting process, which has a kind of logic that I will briefly describe with the aid of this diagram. I distinguish two situations. One, the normal situation, described by the broad lines around the top and the right side of the diagram, and then some additional factors that come into play when there is a widely perceived tragedy of some kind involving a medical good. That triggers a special episode very often. Normally, what we have is what political scientists call iron triangle politics, or maybe it's iron quadrilateral politics, or iron pentagon politics. But there are a handful of actors, interest groups that interact all the time. The congressional oversight committees that are in charge of the FDA, the agency itself and all its sub-agencies and committees and boards and whatnot. And then there are various interest groups in the public, the people who represent the manufacturers of medical products, for example, are always active with regard to the FDA regulations. And sometimes patient groups are involved, medical authorities and their groups and so forth. All of these people interact routinely. They are appointed to advisory boards in the Food and Drug Administration, and they are heard at hearings that the agency holds with respect to proposed regulations and so forth. So this is the normal course of events for this regulatory agency. From this normal course of events, which I show the news media constantly engaged with, both provoking the agency and the others involved and being provoked by them, we get powers pushed out. The agency, like most regulatory agencies, would like to have more power, more employees, and more money. And so they're constantly pushing out the envelope of their statutory authority in ways that test how far they can go to extend their powers. And so they have some success. In one way or another, they manage to extend their power out, even without any notorious episode on the horizon. And the result of this is that they get more powerful, and what is left of the public's right to decide these issues rather than have the regulators decide it for them is diminished. People's liberty, as it were, to make the decisions about how to deal with their own health problems is diminished when the FDA's power is extended. So what happens here is, in effect, a centralization of decision-making power. Instead of having millions or hundreds of millions of people independently deciding how to go about using products that would enhance their well-being, we have sometimes a single reviewer in Rockville who holds the power to make a decision that will be binding on all of these people. So you can wipe out hundreds of millions of decision-making powers and replace them by the power of one single individual who's a career bureaucrat. Okay. Now, occasionally some big thing happens, referred to the thalidomide tragedy, which came to light in 1962 when thalidomide, which was being used as a sedative, turned out to be the cause of some horrible birth defects in the babies born to women who had used thalidomide during their pregnancy. And the images of these deformed babies were so horrifying that the public was stunned And the result of this and of previous and subsequent medical tragedies that similarly caught the public's attention was that all the actors up here swung into action, particularly Congress and the agency itself, demanding that the FDA be given more powers to presumably prevent the recurrence of such tragic events in the future by having more regulatory power. The presumption is always that if there's a risk, we can reduce it by extending the scope of regulation. But remember, what we're doing is we're replacing the decision-making capacity of hundreds of millions of actors with the decision-making capacity of one person. That's the nature of this regulation. So these events lead to a lot of publicity, shocking revelations, public clamor, pressure for new controls, new laws, new regulatory power, and so forth. And again, the upshot is an extension of regulatory power, a diminution of individual liberty and decision-making. And I've put in a dashed line here. Why is it that we never have a reaction here? Why is it that people don't react, or at least react more visibly or more often or more strongly to the fact that their liberty is being diminished by this process? Why don't we see protests in the streets? Occasionally we have. Probably the most notable ones took place in the 1980s by people suffering from AIDS. They were very upset that the FDA was denying them access to drugs that might have been beneficial to them at that time when the AIDS epidemic was just becoming a tremendous public phenomenon, and people were extremely frightened by it, its emergence. So we rarely see this. So I've asked, is it a missing link here? Why don't we see more of this? Well, it's a good question. The people who make decisions at the FDA respond to incentives, just as people do elsewhere. That's an economist's truism. People respond to incentives. All of economics rests on that presumption. The bureaucrats prefer to advance in their careers. They do not want their incompetence or blameworthiness to be exposed. In their circumstances, the FDA examiners may err in two different ways, which I call type 1 error. This is like statistical type 1 and type 2 error that many of you have studied in your statistics courses. In type 1 error, the examiner does not approve a product that is safe and efficacious. Type 2 error, the examiner approves a product that is not safe or efficacious. And naturally, the examiners want to protect themselves from criticism arising from their commission of errors. So here we've got the situation on the two kinds of errors. A very compressed representation where we forced everything into two categories here, either totally safe and effective or totally unsafe and ineffective. And of course, there are some gray areas in real life that would have to be fitted in if we were complicating the representation, but we don't need to do that for my purposes right now. Right? The examiner's incentives are to avoid a mistake. However, they differ greatly in the two types of error. A former FDA inspector described the situation this way, quote, "Anytime you approve a new drug, you're wide open for attack. If the drug turns out to be less effective than the original data showed, they can nail you for selling out to a drug company. If it turns out to be less safe than anyone had expected, some congressman or a newspaper writer will get you. So there's only one way to play it safe. Turn down the application." These are applications for marketing approval, by the way, for new products. "Turn down the application, or at least stall for time and demand more research. Send the applicant back to the drawing board. Tell him he has to make more tests. Tell him he has to do clinical studies on more patients. Because of such demands for more research, new drug applications commonly consist of 2 or more volumes of summary data and as many as 100 volumes of raw data, sometimes more than 100,000 pages altogether. Think about that. Somebody's supposed to make something out of all this stuff. Although such heavyweight requirements help an FDA examiner to play it safe, they often result in much avoidable suffering and many deaths among the patient population awaiting access to the good. Unfortunately, the news media and members of Congress and the self-described consumer advocates almost never hold the bureaucrats responsible for these so-called invisible or statistical deaths. And they are very real, by the way. They're not really invisible to the friends and family of the dead. And they're not merely statistical either, but that's just how they're described sometimes because they're not publicly known, they're not publicized. They're all a mass of private events that no one is much aware of beyond the individual case. Hence, the cost of a single bureaucrat's career insurance may be, and in some cases surely has been, tremendous sacrifice of human health and life. Consider, for example, that from 1963 to 1973, quote, the FDA's doors were essentially closed to cardiovascular drugs, end quote. Even though cardiovascular disease was the leading cause of death in the United States, and rapid advances were occurring during those years in pharmaceutical therapies. Beta blockers, an especially valuable class of drugs, awaited FDA approval for a decade after they were first used abroad. Dr. William Wardell, a professor of pharmacology, toxicology, and medicine in the University of Rochester, estimated in 1979 that a single beta blocker, and there were a number of these being introduced at the time, but alpranolol, which had already been sold for 3 years in the strictly regulated Swedish market, it could have saved more than 10,000 lives a year in the United States. That's just one drug. The FDA was considering scores of applications in any given year. One drug that was held up could have saved 10,000 lives a year. There's not much doubt that on the beta blocker product alone, which is one small class among many classes of drugs the FDA considers, more people died as a result of delay at the FDA with regard to beta blockers than died in the Korean War and the Vietnam War for the United States put together. So there's a silent mass murder going on in society as a result of what one single bureaucrat in Rockville decides to do to protect his job. Other examples given by Wardell include, quote, years of delay in the availability of at least 4 respiratory drugs, which he names, that cause severe disadvantages to many asthma sufferers, as well as a 6-year lag in the availability of valproate in particular, and the continued absence of nitrazepam that substantially reduced the treatment options for epileptic patients. Lithium carbonate, an effective drug for the treatment of manic depressive disorder, was used in 40 countries before it was approved by the FDA. A 1980 study by the U.S. General Accounting Office examined 14 therapeutically important drugs introduced in the United States between 1975 and 1978. And the GAO analysts, look, this is not radicals criticizing the FDA, it's the GAO, for goodness sake. Very conservative, careful government office. The GAO analysts found that only one of the 14 had become available first in the United States. And for the others, the lag in availability ranged from 2 months to 13 years. Many drugs used successfully abroad are never approved for U.S. use. Just never approved. The applicants don't try or they give up. Astonishingly, the FDA has given little or no weight to foreign evidence of product safety and efficacy. The fact that a drug is being used successfully elsewhere means nothing to these people. They set the rules, you have to jump through their hoops. They don't care how many other governments' hoops you've already jumped through. Nearly all new drugs and devices have been forced to pass through the same rigid, expensive, and time-consuming testing procedure in the United States, even though a product might already have been used successfully elsewhere for many years. Economists Henry Grabowski and John Vernon at Duke University did many studies of the pharmaceutical industry, and considering the results of their own research along with the findings of other studies comparing the experience of various countries, they concluded, quote, U.S. citizens have experienced sizable foregone health benefits from regulatory-induced delays in obtaining beneficial new drugs while obtaining relatively modest benefits in the form of less exposure to drug toxicity. Perhaps the most damaging consequence of the FDA's regulations since 1962, when the testing requirements were made much more rigid, elaborate, and time-consuming, is the slowdown in the rate of innovation. In view of the high costs of securing FDA approval to market new products, many manufacturers conclude that otherwise promising R&D projects will not be profitable. As a result, beneficial new drugs and devices are never created. Suffering and death that might have been prevented continue unabated. Of course, since the innovations never come into existence, hardly anyone appreciates that they've been sacrificed on the altar of regulation. At present, the estimates of the costs of bringing a new chemical entity to the stage where it has marketing approval from the FDA are approximately $1 billion. If you have a small company that has come up somehow with a great idea for a new drug, you've devised this thing, remember that besides all the costs you have of keeping the company running, paying its employees and paying the interest on bank loans and whatever that is required to operate the firm, you're going to have to expend approximately $1 billion on meeting FDA requirements. Now, there aren't very many small companies that can attract that much venture capital. That is an enormous amount of venture capital, and very, very few companies can manage it. Those who do somehow find the financing to get to this stage usually exhaust their ability to finance a continuation and end up selling out to one of the big pharmaceutical companies who have the resources to endure these high fixed costs. Now notice these costs are all borne before you get $1 of revenue back, because you aren't even allowed to sell the product until you get the FDA's approval to put it on the market. So there's a high interest costs here too. You're having to meet all these costs now, and your revenues are in the future and have to be discounted to be comparable to those costs. When we talk about the rule of law in legal studies or political philosophy, the rule of law means much more than the requirement that the legislature authorize an exercise of power by the executive branch of government. As classical liberals understand it, the rule of law requires that the law be clear and understandable, that penalties for violation be predictable, and that the law be applied equally to everyone, including members of the government. The FDA's actions, though broadly sanctioned by legislation, fail to satisfy these criteria. In stark violation of a genuine rule of law, the FDA's actions are frequently arbitrary and capricious, sometimes even blatantly unconstitutional, as they are, for example, in the FDA's many efforts to restrict freedom of speech. you'll recall the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. It says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. It didn't say except if health is at stake. It didn't say unless the FDA does the abridging. It says Congress shall make no law. People don't know what it means to say no law, because lawyers have twisted constitutional jurisprudence into the idea that it didn't really mean no law when it said no law. So the FDA is in fact able to go about restricting speech on a very wide scale, despite its being blatantly unconstitutional for the government to do this in any form for any reason. In the medical device industry, where the FDA conducted a jihad during the early 1990s, manufacturers remonstrated that their cited violations of the agency's good manufacturing practice regulations often arise because the regulations are vague. And they are often vague. Even companies, and I'm quoting now, even companies that genuinely try to comply fully with the U.S. GMPs can find themselves cited for violations, end quote. Companies whose products are esteemed by customers have been forced to stop production because their paperwork did not satisfy the regulators. I was present at one of these episodes in the 1990s when Physio Control Corporation, the leading manufacturer of defibrillators in the United States, was compelled to shut down for more than a year as a result of FDA complaints about its paperwork, basically. The products were performing as well as ever. The Health Industry Manufacturers Association complained that the FDA, quote, has not made clear the type of data it wants to see, end quote. Therefore, companies must make a series of information submissions, hoping that something will satisfy the regulators. Sometimes the FDA requests one type of study, then changes its requirement and requests another type after the company has completed the first one. The director of this agency I mentioned, the Health Industry Manufacturers Association, Allen Magazine, describes the device approval process as, quote, a giant guessing game. Remember what I said about the rule of law? The clarity it requires? It's not a giant guessing game. If the law is a giant guessing game, there is no true rule of law. Supplicants can expect no reliable guidance by asking the FDA what is required. The agency does not respond to inquiries expeditiously. When it does respond, the response often lacks substance. Moreover, after years of countermanding the informal device given to regulated parties, it announced in 1992 that it would no longer be bound by its own formal advice. It's like when you call up the IRS, and they tell you, here's what you do on your form. And studies have shown that it's usually wrong advice you're given. But if you violate it, you may be penalized by the IRS later. And the fact that the IRS employee told you differently is no defense. And likewise here, there's no defense against the FDA just because their own employee told you one thing and you did it. Indeed, the head of the FDA's drug surveillance branch stated the following: we used to say that if a company made certain changes, then we would probably not take any action. Now, we won't. Now, even if they make the changes, they might end up in court. We want to say to these companies that you don't know when or how we'll strike. We want to eliminate predictability. End quote. That a so-called civil servant would make such a statement is stunning. That's the sort of statement that the KGB might have made evident in the old USSR. We want to eliminate the rule of law and keep everyone in suspense as to when and why we will hurt you. Recourse to the courts, as I mentioned, which is costly, time-consuming, and full of uncertainty, holds little promise of protection. in view of what Wardell has called, quote, the extreme vulnerability of the industrial firm that argues with the FDA, end quote. Without a search warrant, the FDA may inspect a company's plant and records at any time. Because the regulations are so numerous and so often vague, many volumes of the Code of Federal Regulation contain those currently in force. If you go to the Code of Federal Regulations and Google CFR Title 21, it'll tell you all the regulations currently in force for the FDA. I just went there this morning to see how it looks as of today. And as of today, that code has 1,405 distinct subject parts. And if you plow into some of them, which you can by just clicking a few times, you'll see that they are virtually incomprehensible. Sometimes a lawyer might be able to make something of them, sometimes a chemist, sometimes an engineer. Just depends on what the specific regulation is. But my point is that they're extremely numerous, extremely complex, and I can guarantee you if their inspectors want to find you in violation, they will do so with no trouble at all. So, the agency possesses the power to destroy a company at will, to retaliate for past resistance, or to make an example by closing down the firm's operation, seizing the property. Sometimes they make a raid and they just haul off everything they get there, the computers, the products, the whole operation. I knew a doctor in Seattle who had this happen to him because he was using vitamins to provide therapy to people with various ailments. Vitamins. Okay. There is a place for paternalism. You may quote me. Right? There is a place for paternalism. It is in the family, where young children are incapable of making wise decisions for themselves, and where a parent linked to the children by bonds of love and responsibility may normally be relied upon to decide what is best for the children. But when paternalism becomes a form of government, when the individual freedom and responsibility of competent adult citizens are suppressed in favor of exclusive decision-making by central planning boards, no one should expect a healthy outcome. For more than half a century, Americans have been forbidden to make important decisions regarding their own health, decisions on which each individual's life and health depend. Of course, we've been assured by those who wield the power that they act only in our best interest. But anyone who makes even a superficial study of the FDA, its regulations, and its congressional overseers quickly discovers that the official line is far from the truth. This government agency, like all of the others, is a political institution, swayed by the ceaseless quest of its leaders for position, publicity, power, privilege, and perquisites, all associated with a big budget and a far-reaching agenda. It's a mistake to suppose that the FDA acts or even attempts to act so that, all things considered, suffering and loss of life are minimized. Instead, responding to the asymmetrical incentives created by the reactions of news media, certain members of Congress, and so-called consumer advocates, FDA officials systematically strive to avoid type 2 errors while disregarding type 1 errors, not relishing the negative publicity sure to follow their approval of medical goods that later cause harm, even relatively slight harm. They adopt the role of obstructionists, requiring ever more stringent, expensive, and time-consuming testing before allowing goods to reach the market. That avoidable suffering and death routinely occur while they drag their feet and protect their careers does not sway them, because hardly anyone holds them accountable for the harm caused by their commission of type 1 errors. Well, I can see that I have eaten up much more of my time than I should have at this point, so I'm going to change course a little bit here. I want to just call to your attention, however, that when we talk about risk, which is what's at stake here, these are products that we're talking about that are intrinsically risky. There's no such thing as a risk-free product of any kind, for that matter. Water could kill you, as you know. But in sufficiently small amounts, it's good for you. Okay? So just as for toxicity being in the dose, risk is in the dose and a lot of other things. But pharmaceuticals and medical devices are intrinsically risky. There's no way around that. But when we think about their riskiness, we need to think about risk in two different senses. There's use risk. If we let a product onto the market, someone may be harmed. But there's prohibition risk. If we keep a good off the market, someone may be harmed also. And so, ideally, what we'd like to do is make the optimal trade-off between these two kinds of risks. We can clearly prevent all of one or all of the other. We can prevent all use risk whatsoever by just outlawing all the products. Then no one will be harmed by it. It's just as we could prevent all automobile accidents by not allowing anyone to drive an automobile. Problem solved, okay? No more use risk. But of course, there are going to be many other kinds of risks that we incur as a result of driving that one to such a low level. These are reciprocal. The more of one, the less of the other. Now, the question is, who should make the decision about where the optimal trade-off lies between use risk and prohibition risk? And I hope I mentioned enough earlier in my talk to suggest that the only location to place decision-making with regard to this trade-off that makes any sense is at the level of the individual who incurs personally these risks. That guy in Rockville is not incurring the risk of a new drug that might cure my disease before it kills me. It's not his problem. Why should it be his legal authority to tell me how to protect my life? This is the most terrifying application of paternalism imaginable. We are literally dealing with matters of life and death here, and yet we have centralized decision-making in this area into the hands of very small groups of people, and sometimes one single individual who controls the outcome. I find this outrageous, and in studying the history of how this has worked, I have concluded that the net effect has been at least an excess number of deaths measured in the hundreds of millions. I can't guarantee you that. I can't give you a precise number, but many other people have reached the same conclusion I have. If you go, as I suggested, to fdareview.org, you'll find many of these studies by very competent analysts. So I didn't dream this conclusion up because I have some kind of irrational hatred of the FDA. What I have is an irrational hatred of moral arrogance. And we have here the most splendid example imaginable of moral arrogance, of people taking it into their own hands to decide the life and death of hundreds of millions of others who have every right to make those decisions for themselves. I'll stop right there. Thank you very much.